a forgotten chapter of American frontier justice where hatred and fear ruled the hearts of men. In the shadow of a great oak that served as both shelter and gallows, the fate of an innocent woman hung by a thread. As the noose tightened and hope faded, a single arrow pierced the gathering darkness, an impossible shot from a bow wielded by hands that weren't supposed to interfere in white men's affairs. This is the tale of two souls from different worlds, brought together by injustice, bound by courage, and ultimately united in a quest for truth that would shake a town to its very foundations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Willow Creek Valley nestled between the rolling Appalachian foothills, like a secret kept by the mountains themselves. The year was 1793, and while the American Revolution had ended a decade prior, the frontier remained a place where civilization clung to the wilderness with tenuous fingers. The small settlement that had sprung up along the banks of the Willow Creek River represented the furthest reaches of American ambition in these parts. A collection of log cabins, a general store, blacksmith, and a newly constructed courthouse that served as the pride of its roughly 300 inhabitants. At the center of town stood the Willow Creek Oak, a massive tree older than the nation itself, its sprawling branches offering shade to the marketplace by day. But the tree served a darker purpose as well. 3 thick branches extended horizontally over the town square, sturdy enough to bear the weight of a man, or, as had been the case twice in the past year, the weight of justice. The morning mist still clung to the valley floor as Catherine Harlow made her way down the muddy path from her cabin toward the town center. At 22, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that belied her youth. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a practical braid, her blue dress faded but clean, and her eyes, a striking hazel that seemed to shift between green and gold, indifferent light, remained fixed on the path ahead. "Catherine," called a voice from the general store's porch, "you're out early, even for you." Samuel Jenkins, the storekeeper, stood with a broom in hand, his round face creased with a smile that had welcomed travelers and townsfolk alike for 15 years. Catherine adjusted her medicine basket and approached. "Mr. Jenkins, Mrs. Mitchell's time is coming. The baby's positioned awkwardly, and I need to brew something to ease her pain." Jenkins nodded, understanding immediately. Since the death of Catherine's father, the town's only doctor, 2 winters prior, she had stepped into the role of healer. Some in town, particularly Judge Harrison, frowned upon a woman practicing medicine, but few could deny her skill with herbs and healing, knowledge passed down from both her father and her Cherokee grandmother. Come in. Take what you need. How is Thomas handling it? First baby's always the hardest on the fathers, I reckon." Catherine smiled slightly. "Pacing like a caged mountain lion. I told him to split wood to keep his mind occupied. By the time this baby arrives, the Mitchells will have enough firewood to last 3 winters. Inside the store, Catherine carefully selected dried herbs from the jars Jenkins kept stocked especially for her. As she worked, the storekeeper moved closer, lowering his voice. "Did you hear? Marshal Williams caught one of the Hampton gang yesterday. Brought him half dead." Catherine's hands stilled momentarily. The Hampton gang had terrorized the valley for months, stealing horses, robbing travelers, and leaving destruction in their wake. Most recently, they had burned the Barneses' homestead to the ground, though thankfully the family had escaped. "Which one?" she asked, measuring herbs carefully into small paper packets. "Not Hampton himself. One of his men, Silas Tucker. Marshall's got him locked up tight. Judge Harrison is riding in from Coopersville to hold court tomorrow." Catherine nodded absently, her mind already returning to Mrs. Mitchell's impending delivery. She paid for her purchases and stepped back into the cool morning air. the mist now burning away under the strengthening sun. As she made her way back through town, she passed the small jailhouse where Marshal Daniel Williams stood watching the street, his weathered face stern beneath his wide-brimmed hat. At 45, the Marshal had served in the Revolution alongside Catherine's father and had been a fixture of protection in the valley since its earliest days. "Catherine," he acknowledged with a tip of his hat. "Heading to the Mitchells?" "Yes, Marshal. The baby's coming, but something's not right." Concern flickered across his face. "Need any help?" She shook her head. "Not yet. If things turn difficult, I'll send Thomas for you." Williams nodded, understanding the unspoken arrangement. Since her father's death, the Marshal had taken it upon himself to look after Catherine, though she fiercely maintained her independence. "Be careful on the North Trail," he warned. "There have been reports of Shawnee hunters crossing onto settlement lands." Catherine met his gaze evenly. "The Shawnee have been hunting these valleys since before our grandparents were born, Marshal. The imaginary lines we draw mean little to them." The Marshal's expression hardened slightly. "Those imaginary lines are the difference between peace and war out here, Catherine. Just watch yourself." She nodded and continued on her way, the Marshal's warning echoing in her mind. Relations with the Shawnee had grown increasingly strained as more settlers pushed into the Ohio Valley. While Willow Creek had maintained an uneasy peace, incidents were increasing throughout the territory. The Mitchell cabin stood a mile north of town, built on a small rise overlooking a bend in the creek. As Catherine approached, she could hear the rhythmic sound of an axe splitting wood. Thomas Mitchell, a tall man with broad shoulders and hands roughened by his work as a carpenter, paused as he saw her approach. "Catherine!" He dropped his axe and rushed forward. "Emma's pains are coming faster. She's calling for you." Inside, Emma Mitchell lay on the bed, her normally serene face contorted in pain, blonde hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. Catherine set her basket down and immediately began examining the young woman. "The baby's turned," she confirmed after a careful examination. "We need to try to shift it before things progress further." For the next hour, Catherine worked methodically, applying techniques her father had taught her and brewing a tea from the herbs she'd purchased. Outside, Thomas resumed his wood-splitting with renewed vigor, each strike of the axe punctuating his wife's cries. "There," Catherine murmured as she felt the baby shift beneath her hands. "That's better. Now we wait." As dusk settled over the valley, Emma's cries reached a crescendo. Catherine positioned herself at the foot of the bed, speaking calm instructions, as Thomas held his wife's hand. With a final push and a strangled scream, new life entered the world, a healthy baby boy with a shock of dark hair and powerful lungs that announced his arrival to the gathering darkness outside. "You have a son," Catherine announced, cleaning and wrapping the infant before placing him in Emma's exhausted arms. "Daniel," Emma whispered, looking up at her husband with tears in her eyes. "After your father." Thomas's face glowed with pride and relief as he gently stroked his son's head. Daniel Mitchell, a fine name for a fine boy. Catherine cleaned up quietly, preparing to leave the new family to their joy. As she gathered her things, Thomas pressed payment into her hand, more than she typically charged. "We wouldn't have him without you," he said simply, emotion thickening his voice. Catherine squeezed his arm. "Your son was determined to join this world, Thomas. I just helped ease the path." The night had fully descended by the time Catherine started back toward town. The half-moon provided just enough light to follow the path, and the familiar sounds of the forest, the hoot of an owl, the distant yip of a fox, accompanied her journey. Despite her exhaustion, her steps were light with the satisfaction of a life safely delivered. A mile from town, Catherine paused. Something had changed in the forest's symphony, a subtle shift that raised the fine hairs on the back of her neck. She wasn't alone. Slowly, she turned, scanning the trees that lined the path. At first, she saw nothing but shadows and moonlight. Then a movement, too controlled to be animal, too deliberate to be wind. "I know you're there," she called, her voice steadier than she felt. "Show yourself." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, like a shadow separating from the greater darkness, a figure emerged onto the path 20 paces ahead. He stood taller than most men Catherine knew, his frame lean but powerful. Even in the dim moonlight, she could make out the distinctive patterns painted across his bare chest, the knife and tomahawk at his belt, and the bow held loosely in his left hand. His hair was shaved on the sides in the traditional Shawnee warrior style, with a single strip running down the center of his head, adorned with a hawk feather. Neither spoke. Catherine's heart pounded against her ribs, but she refused to show fear, despite the stories that circulated through town, tales of Shawnee raids on isolated homesteads, of scalping and burning. She reminded herself that the local bands had kept pace with Willow Creek. The warrior's dark eyes assessed her with equal intensity, taking in her medicine basket and blood-stained apron. After what seemed an eternity, he stepped aside, clearing the path. Catherine inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement and moved forward, maintaining a steady pace as she passed him. She could feel his gaze on her back, but resisted the urge to run or look behind her. Only when she reached the outskirts of her town did she release the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The encounter left her unsettled, though no threat had been made. Something in the warrior's eyes, a quiet intensity, an intelligence that seemed to see beyond the surface, lingered in her mind. The town was unusually active for the late hour. Lights burned in windows, and voices carried from the direction of the tavern. As Catherine approached the town square, she saw a group of men gathered outside the jailhouse, their postures tense with anger. "Evening, Catherine," called Jacob Thornton, the blacksmith, as she passed. "Heard you delivered the Mitchell baby. All well?" "A healthy boy," she confirmed, slowing her pace. "What's happening here?" Thornton's expression darkened. "Tucker said, Hampton is planning to hit the supply wagon coming from Coopersville tomorrow. Marshall's organizing men to ride out at first light." Before Catherine could respond, a commotion erupted from the jailhouse. The door burst open, and Marshal Williams emerged, physically restraining Judge Ezekiel Harrison, whose face was flushed with rage. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You overstep your authority, Williams," the judge shouted, straightening his waistcoat after the marshal released him. At 50, Harrison cut an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with silver-streaked dark hair, and the bearing of a man accustomed to respect. As the appointed circuit judge for 3 counties, his word carried the weight of law. "With respect, Judge, I'll handle this my way," Williams replied, his voice calm but firm. "We need Tucker alive. If we're going to catch Hampton." Harrison's gaze swept over the gathered men before landing on Catherine. His expression shifted subtly, as it always did when he saw her, a mixture of disapproval and something else she couldn't quite name. "Miss Harlow," he acknowledged coldly. "Still playing at being a physician, I see." Catherine met his gaze evenly. "Just returning from delivering the Mitchell baby, Judge Harrison, a healthy boy." The judge made a dismissive sound. "Women should leave medicine to those properly trained. Your father would have—" "My father trained me himself, Judge," Catherine interrupted, a rare edge creeping into her voice. "And I believe he would be proud to see me using that knowledge to help our community." A tense silence fell over the gathering. Judge Harrison's disapproval of Catherine was well known, though few understood its source. Some attributed it to traditional views about women's roles. Others whispered about his failed attempt to court Catherine's mother years before. She had married the doctor instead. Marshal Williams cleared his throat, breaking the standoff. "Catherine, you should get home. It's late and these are matters for the law to handle." She nodded, suddenly aware of her exhaustion. "Good night, Marshal. Judge." With a final nod to the others, she continued toward her cabin at the edge of town. Behind her, she could hear the discussion resuming, the men's voices rising and falling like the tide. Judge Harrison's distinctive baritone cut through the others, authoritative and unyielding. Whatever plan the marshal had in mind, the judge seemed determined to overrule it. Catherine's cabin came into view, a modest structure her father had built with his own hands when they first settled in the valley. A small garden surrounded it, filled with both common and rare medicinal plants. Inside, everything remained as it had been during her father's life. His medical books carefully arranged on shelves, his instruments cleaned and stored in leather rolls, his chair still positioned by the hearth where he had spent evenings teaching Catherine the healing arts. As she prepared for bed, Catherine's mind returned to the Shawnee warrior on the path. There had been something different about him, something that set him apart from the occasional tribal members who came to trade in Willow Creek. A stillness, a watchfulness that spoke of deeper purpose. Little did she know that their brief encounter was merely the first thread in a tapestry that would soon bind their fates together against a backdrop of violence, prejudice, and a justice system vulnerable to corruption. Miles away, in a hidden valley known only to the Shawnee, the warrior, called Swift Arrow, returned to his solitary camp. Unlike most of his people who lived in the main village, he had chosen a life apart, not in rejection of his heritage, but in pursuit of a path few understood. Trained since childhood in the ancient art of bow hunting, he had achieved a mastery that some called supernatural. His arrows found their marks with uncanny precision, guided by an instinct that went beyond mere skill. The white woman on the trail had surprised him. Most settlers showed fear or hatred when encountering a Shawnee warrior alone in the forest. But her eyes had held something different. Caution, yes, but also a steady assessment that reminded him of how his own people sized up potential allies or enemies. The bloodstains on her clothing had told their own story, not of violence, but of birth, of new life brought into the world through her hands. As Swift Arrow added wood to his small fire, he could not have known that within days those same hands would be bound in chains beneath the great oak in Willow Creek. Nor could he have foreseen that his next arrow would fly not toward game, but toward those very chains in a shot that would change both their destinies forever. Dawn broke over Willow Creek, with an ominous red glow that painted the valley in shades of blood and fire. Catherine woke earlier than usual, troubled by dreams that faded upon waking but left a lingering unease. The morning air carried the first hint of autumn's approach as she gathered fresh herbs from her garden, the dew-laden leaves soaking the hem of her skirt. A horse's whinny drew her attention to the road where Marshal Williams rode past, accompanied by 6 armed men. Their grim expressions confirmed what Catherine already knew. They were riding to intercept Hampton and his gang before they could attack the supply wagon. "Godspeed, Marshal," she called out. Williams reined his horse, turning to face her. "Pray we're not too late, Catherine. There's medicine on that wagon for the Turner boy." 8-year-old James Turner had been battling fever for days, and Catherine's remedies had only managed to keep it from worsening. "I'll check on James while you're gone," she promised. The marshal nodded gratefully. Judge Harrison wanted to hang Tucker immediately, but his information could save lives today. A shadow crossed his face. "Watch yourself. Harrison's in a foul mood, and he's acting as magistrate until I return." With that warning, Williams rejoined his men, and they rode toward the western pass where the supply wagon would enter the valley. Catherine finished her harvesting and prepared a fresh poultice for James Turner before heading into town. The usual morning bustle seemed subdued, as though the departure of the marshal and his men had left a vacuum of authority that made everyone uneasy. At the Turner household, Catherine found young James still burning with fever, his small body wrapped in sweat-soaked sheets, while his mother Rebecca kept vigil beside him. "Any change?" Catherine asked, placing a cool hand on the boy's forehead. Rebecca Turner shook her head, exhaustion evident in the dark circles beneath her eyes. The fever peaked during the night. He was calling for his father. Her voice broke slightly. James. Turner Sr. had been killed by a falling tree the previous winter, leaving Rebecca to raise their son alone. Catherine worked methodically, replacing the old poultice with the fresh one and brewing a tea from willow bark and other herbs. "This will help reduce the fever," she explained. "The supply wagon should arrive today with stronger medicine." Rebecca clutched Catherine's hand. "I don't know how to thank you. Just keep him drinking. I'll return this evening." Catherine smiled, reassuringly, though concern gnawed at her. Without the medicine from Coopersville, the boy's chances dimmed with each passing hour. As Catherine left the Turner home, the town bell began to ring. Not the measured toll that marked the hour, but an urgent, continuous clanging that signaled emergency. She quickened her pace toward the town square, where a crowd had already gathered. At the center stood Horace Fleming, owner of the trading post on the eastern edge of the settlement. His normally ruddy face was ashen, his clothes torn and blood-stained. Judge Harrison stood beside him, one hand on the man's shoulder, his expression grave. "They came out of nowhere," Fleming was saying, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "At least 10 of them, Hampton himself leading the charge." Catherine pushed forward. "The supply wagon? What happened?" Fleming's bloodshot eyes found her. "Ambushed, 2 miles east of Cooper's Ridge. They knew exactly where to wait. The guards?" someone called. "Dead, all 3. Fleming's voice cracked. "I only survived because I was scouting ahead and saw it happen from the ridge. They took everything, medicines, ammunition, winter supplies." A murmur of dismay rippled through the gathering. Judge Harrison raised his hand for silence. "This cowardly attack cannot go unanswered," he intoned, his deep voice commanding attention. "Marshal Williams and his men are tracking the criminals as we speak. But this tragedy raises a troubling question." His cold gaze swept the crowd. How did Hampton know precisely when and where to strike? An uncomfortable silence fell over the square. Harrison continued, his words deliberate. "Someone in Willow Creek betrayed us. Someone provided Hampton with information that cost 3 good men their lives." Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The judge's accusation hung over the crowd like a storm cloud. Tucker talked only to the marshal, Peter Walsh, the tavern keeper, pointed out. Who else knew the details? Indeed, Harrison's eyes narrowed. The marshal, myself, and those the marshal may have confided in. His gaze settled meaningfully on Catherine. She stiffened, suddenly aware that several people had turned to look at her. "What exactly are you implying, Judge Harrison?" "I imply nothing, Miss Harlow. I merely observe that you and the marshal share a certain closeness. He may have mentioned details of the wagon's route." Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Marshal Williams told me nothing about the route, and I resent your insinuation." Harrison shrugged, the gesture dismissive. "These are dangerous times. We must consider all possibilities." The crowd began to disperse, but Catherine noticed the lingering glances, the whispered conversations. Judge Harrison's words had planted a seed of suspicion, however absurd. She turned away, determined to ignore it, and headed toward the general store to check on available supplies that might help young James Turner. The day progressed with an undercurrent of tension. By mid-afternoon, there was still no word from Marshal Williams and his men. Catherine spent the hours between patient visits gathering what medicinal herbs remained in her stores and preparing alternatives to the medicines lost with the wagon. As the sun began its descent, Catherine returned to the Turner home with her makeshift remedies. She found Rebecca in tears, cradling her son's limp body. "His breathing changed," Rebecca sobbed. "It's so shallow now and he won't wake up." Catherine worked frantically, using every technique her father had taught her. She bathed the boy in cool water, administered her strongest fever remedy, and monitored his pulse. For hours, she fought against the fever's grip, refusing to surrender the child to the illness. Outside, darkness fell over Willow Creek. Lights appeared in windows, and the town settled into an uneasy evening vigil, awaiting news from the marshal's party. It was nearly midnight when James Turner's fever finally broke. The boy's breathing deepened, and color returned to his pale cheeks. Rebecca wept with relief, clutching her son's hand as though afraid he might slip away again. "You saved him," she whispered to Catherine. "Thank God for your knowledge." Catherine smiled tiredly. "He saved himself. He's stronger than the fever." She gathered her things, exhaustion settling into her bones. "I'll come back in the morning. Keep him drinking the tea I left." The streets were deserted as Catherine made her way home, the only sounds the distant hoot of an owl and the soft rustling of leaves in the night breeze. Her mind was too weary to dwell on Harrison's insinuations, or the missing supply wagon. All she wanted was the comfort of her bed and a few hours of uninterrupted sleep. A shadow detached itself from the darkness beside her cabin door. Catherine froze, her hand instinctively reaching for the small knife she carried in her pocket. "Catherine." "Harlow?" The voice was male, unfamiliar, with a slight tremor that suggested injury or exhaustion. "Who's asking?" she countered, not moving closer. The figure stepped into the moonlight. It was a young man, perhaps 20, with sandy hair and a blood-stained shirt. He clutched his side where dark liquid seeped between his fingers. "Name's Edward Prescott. Marshal Williams sent me." Catherine rushed forward as the young man's knees buckled. She caught him before he hit the ground and helped him inside her cabin. Laying him on the examination table her father had built, she quickly lit lamps and assessed his wound, a deep gash across his ribs that had bled profusely but appeared to have missed vital organs. "What happened?" "Where's the marshal?" she asked, cutting away the ruined shirt. Edward winced as she began cleaning the wound. "Ambushed. Not just Hampton's gang. Shawnee warriors too, working together." He paused, gathering strength. "We tracked them to a camp near Eagle's Ravine. Hampton was there dividing the stolen goods with a group of Shawnee. The marshal sent me back to warn the town while they continued tracking." Catherine's hands stilled. "Shawnee, are you certain?" "Saw them with my own eyes. War paint, feathered headdresses. One of them did this to me." He gestured to his wound. "With one of those curved knives they carry." Catherine resumed her work, her mind racing. The local Shawnee bands had maintained peace with Willow Creek for years. An alliance with Hampton would shatter that fragile coexistence. "This needs stitching," she told him, reaching for her father's medical kit. "It will hurt." Edward nodded grimly. "Do what you must, but there's more you need to know." He gripped her wrist with surprising strength. Hampton mentioned a name, said their friend in Willow Creek had proven valuable. "What name?" Catherine asked, threading a needle. "He didn't say. But one of the Shawnee warriors had something that caught my eye." Edward's voice dropped to a whisper. "A medicine pouch, distinctive with beadwork in the shape of a hawk, just like the one your father used to wear." Catherine's blood ran cold. The medicine pouch had been a gift to her father from her Cherokee grandmother, passed down to Catherine after his death. It hung even now from a hook by her work table, where she always kept it. "That's impossible," she breathed. "It never leaves." "My cabin." Edward's eyes were already growing heavy with exhaustion and blood loss. "Just telling you what I saw. The marshal needs to know." His words slurred as consciousness slipped away from him. Catherine completed the stitching while Edward slept, her mind churning with implications. If someone had taken her medicine pouch or created a convincing replica and planted it with the Shawnee, the intent was clear: to frame her as the traitor who had helped Hampton. But who would do such a thing? And why? Dawn was approaching. When Catherine finished tending to Edward's wound, she had just covered him with a blanket when a pounding at her door startled her. "Catherine Harlow!" a voice shouted. "Open in the name of the law!" Heart racing, Catherine opened the door to find Deputy Nathan Collins standing there, flanked by 4 armed men. Behind them, Judge Harrison sat astride his horse, face impassive in the grey light of early morning. "Deputy Collins, what's the meaning of this?" "Catherine Harlow," Collins announced formally, "you're under arrest for conspiracy with enemies of Willow Creek, resulting in the deaths of 3 militiamen." Catherine stared in disbelief. "What? That's absurd!" Harrison dismounted, his movements deliberate. "We have a witness who places your property in the hands of Shawnee warriors allied with Hampton, the same warriors who helped ambush our supply wagon." "Edward Prescott," Catherine realized aloud. "He came to me injured. He's inside." "We know," Harrison interrupted coldly. "Prescott delivered his report to me before seeking medical attention. Quite thorough, including the detail about your distinctive medicine pouch being in possession of a Shawnee warrior." "I've never given my pouch to anyone," Catherine protested. "It's right here." She turned toward the hook where the pouch always hung, only to find it empty. The blood drained from her face. Looking for this, Harrison produced the familiar, beaded pouch from his coat pocket. "Found in the possession of a Shawnee prisoner captured by a hunting party this morning, along with this." He held up a folded paper. A detailed map of the supply route, written in a feminine hand, remarkably similar to yours. Catherine felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "That's not possible. I didn't search the cabin," Harrison ordered the men. "Find anything that connects her to Hampton or the Shawnee." Deputy Collins hesitated. "Judge, shouldn't we wait for Marshal Williams to return?" "The Marshal may be dead, Deputy, and if he lives, he may find his trust has been misplaced." Harrison's eyes bored into Catherine. "Check on Prescott. If he's stable, move him to a proper bed in town." As the men entered her cabin, Catherine struggled to make sense of what was happening. "Judge Harrison, I've lived in this valley my entire life. My father served this community for decades. Why would I betray these people?" Harrison regarded her coldly. "Perhaps your mixed heritage has finally shown its true influence. Cherokee blood has a way of revealing itself, doesn't it?" The casual racism stunned Catherine into momentary silence. Before she could respond, one of the men emerged from her cabin, holding a small leather packet. "Found this under a floorboard beneath her bed," he announced, handing it to Harrison. The judge opened the packet carefully. Inside were gold coins, more money than most people in Willow Creek would see in a year, and a crude drawing of what appeared to be Hampton's hideout. "Payment for services rendered," Harrison pronounced, displaying the contents for all to see. "The evidence is irrefutable." "That's not mine," Catherine protested, her voice rising with desperation. "Someone is framing me." "Bind her hands," Harrison ordered. "She'll stand trial as soon as Marshal Williams returns, if he returns. Until then, she'll be held where everyone can see the face of betrayal." Catherine struggled as Deputy Collins reluctantly bound her wrists with coarse rope. "This is madness. I've done nothing wrong." "Take her to the Oak," Harrison commanded, ignoring her protests. Word of Catherine's arrest spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. As she was marched through town toward the Great Oak, people emerged from their homes and businesses to watch in shock and confusion. Some faces showed anger, others doubt, but none stepped forward to intervene against the judge's authority. At the Oak, Collins secured her bonds to a metal ring embedded in the massive trunk, a recent addition installed for holding prisoners. During public punishments, the rope allowed her to sit or stand, but not to move more than a few feet from the tree. "I'm sorry," Collins murmured as he checked the bindings. The marshal will sort this out when he returns. If I'm guilty of helping Hampton, Catherine asked quietly, why would I have saved Edward Prescott's life last night? Why not let him die with his suspicions? Collins had no answer. He straightened, avoiding her eyes, and rejoined the others. Judge Harrison addressed the growing crowd. Until Marshal Williams returns, Catherine Harlow will remain here as an example of the cost of betrayal. No one is to provide her food or water without my express permission. She will face frontier justice for her crimes against this community. As Harrison and his men departed, the crowd lingered, murmuring among themselves. Catherine recognized faces she had known all her life, people she had helped birth, heal, comfort in times of grief. Some couldn't meet her gaze. Others started with open hostility. "I didn't do this," she called out, her voice steady despite her fear. "Someone has gone to great lengths to frame me. Ask yourselves why." A few faces registered doubt, but most turned away. Only Samuel Jenkins approached, defying Harrison's order by offering a dipper of water. "I don't believe you are capable of this, Catherine," he said quietly as she drank. "Your father was the finest man I knew. His daughter wouldn't betray us." Catherine grasped this small lifeline of faith. "Thank you, Samuel. Something isn't right about any of this. The marshal needs to know." Harrison's appointed himself acting marshal until Williams returns. Jenkins glanced nervously over his shoulder. "Be careful what you say. The judge has strange power over people these days." As Jenkins retreated, Catherine leaned back against the oak's rough bark. The events of the past 24 hours swirled in her mind like leaves caught in a whirlpool. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to frame her, stealing her medicine pouch, planting gold and maps in her cabin, forging her handwriting. But who and why specifically target her? The sun climbed higher, its heat intensifying as noon approached. Without shelter, Catherine's exposed position beneath the oak offered no relief from the blistering rays. Thirst clawed at her throat, and hunger gnawed at her stomach. Few dared approach after Jenkins' act of kindness, though she felt the weight of watching eyes from surrounding buildings. Through her growing discomfort, Catherine forced herself to think logically. If Hampton had truly allied with Shawnee warriors, that represented a significant escalation. The Shawnee she had encountered on the path hadn't seemed like someone who would partner with a criminal like Hampton. His demeanor had been watchful, but not hostile. As afternoon waned, Catherine's thoughts turned to Marshal Williams. Had he survived the ambush? Was he even now tracking Hampton back to Willow Creek? Or had her friend, one of the few connections to her father that remained, fallen, victim to the violence that seemed to be closing in around their once peaceful valley? The shadows lengthened as the sun began its descent behind the western mountains. Catherine's wrists were raw from the coarse rope, and her mouth felt like parchment. The town's activity had continued around her, people going about their business, while casting occasional glances toward the woman bound to the oak, a public spectacle just as Harrison had intended. As twilight approached, Catherine became aware of a figure watching her from the edge of the forest that bordered the eastern side of town. At first, she thought exhaustion was causing her to imagine things, but as her eyes adjusted to the gathering dusk, she recognized the distinctive silhouette of the Shawnee warrior she had encountered on the path. Swift Arrow stood motionless, partially concealed by the trees, observing the woman bound to the great oak. Even at this distance, he could see the injustice being done. The white settlement's ways often confused him, but the sight of the healer woman, whose hands had brought new life into the world just days before, now chained like an animal, stirred something deep within him. He had been tracking Hampton's gang for weeks, ever since they had burned a Shawnee hunting camp and murdered 2 young braves. The alliance Harrison claimed existed between Hampton and the Shawnee was a lie, one of many that seemed to surround the events unfolding in the valley. As darkness fell over Willow Creek, Swift Arrow melted back into the forest. What he had witnessed demanded action, but wisdom required careful planning. The woman would not face the white man's false justice alone. Before the new day dawned, his arrow would fly true, not to take life, but to deliver justice of a different kind. Darkness shrouded Willow Creek as the last lanterns winked out in cabin windows. Only the jailhouse remained illuminated, where Deputy Collins kept a reluctant watch. At the Great Oak, Catherine drifted in and out of consciousness, her throat parched and limbs stiff from hours of confinement. The night air had turned cool, carrying the scent of pine and distant wood smoke. 2 guards, appointed by Harrison, sat nearby, passing a flask between them. They had been instructed to prevent any assistance reaching the prisoner, though their vigilance had waned as the night deepened. "Don't see why we gotta sit out here all night," grumbled Eli Packer, a tenant farmer from the North Ridge. "She ain't going nowhere tied up like that." His companion, Victor Rhodes, took another swig from the flask. "Judge says she's got friends among the Shawnee. Can't risk them trying to free her." Eli snorted. "Shawnee ain't fool enough to come into town. Sides, if she's truly working with Hampton, wouldn't he try to silence her before she could talk? Maybe that's why we're really here," Victor suggested, lowering his voice. "Not to keep people from helping her, but to catch Hampton if he comes." Catherine heard their conversation through the fog of her discomfort. The accusation that she worked with Hampton still seemed like a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. Her thoughts turned to young James Turner, wondering if he continued to improve or if the fever had returned in her absence. A soft rustling from the nearby trees drew her attention, though she was careful not to alert the guards. At first, she saw nothing but shadows among shadows. Then a subtle movement, something or someone advancing with such stealth that it seemed part of the night itself. Catherine held her breath as a figure emerged briefly into a patch of moonlight, before vanishing again into darkness. It was the Shawnee warrior, moving steadily closer to the oak while remaining invisible to the half-drunk guards. Swift Arrow had spent hours studying the settlement's patterns from the forest edge. He had counted the guards, noted their positions, and mapped every approach to the Great Oak. Now he circled to the north side of the square, where the shadows were deepest and the guards' attention most distant. The bow in his hands was unlike those carried by most Shawnee warriors. Crafted from a single piece of Osage orange wood and backed with sinew, it had been a gift from his grandfather, a legendary archer whose skill was still recounted in tribal stories. Swift Arrow had spent thousands of hours mastering it, developing a connection so profound that the bow seemed an extension of his own body. He notched an arrow, one specially prepared for tonight's work. Its shaft was of straightest ash, its head not the broad hunting point used for game, but a narrow, razor-sharp blade designed to slice rather than pierce. Such an arrow could split a hanging hair at 50 paces in his hands. The guards' conversation had turned to complaints about Harrison's increasing authority in the marshal's absence. Their attention had drifted fully away from their prisoner. Swift Arrow inhaled slowly, centering himself in the perfect stillness his grandfather had taught him. The world narrowed to a single point of focus, the rope binding Catherine's hands to the iron ring. He drew the bowstring back to his cheek, feeling the familiar tension build in his shoulders. Catherine sensed rather than saw the arrow's release. One moment, the ropes bit into her raw wrists. The next, her hands feel free as the bindings parted with a soft whisper of severed fibers. The arrow continued its perfect flight, embedding itself in the oak's trunk with barely a sound. For a heartbeat, she sat motionless, scarcely believing what had happened. The guards remained oblivious, their backs turned, flask passing between them. A shadow detached itself from the tree line, approaching with preternatural silence. Swift Arrow appeared beside her, pressing a finger to his lips in the universal sign for quiet. His dark eyes met hers, conveying urgency without words. Catherine nodded her understanding. Moving carefully to avoid alerting the guards, she rose to her feet, wincing as blood rushed back into her numbed limbs. Swift Arrow supported her with a steady hand, guiding her toward the shadows from which he had emerged. They had covered perhaps 20 paces when Eli turned, reaching for the flask Victor held. His eyes widened as he registered the empty space. Beneath the oak where their prisoner should have been. "Victor!" he hissed, scrambling to his feet. "She's gone!" The shout that followed shattered the night's stillness. "Prisoner, escape! To arms!" Swift Arrow's grip on Catherine's arm tightened. Without words, he urged her into a run, heading not for the open forest as she expected, but toward the cluster of buildings that made up the eastern edge of town. Behind them, confusion erupted. Lights flared to life in windows, and men spilled from the tavern and boarding house. Eli's voice carried above the commotion, directing searchers toward the western road, the opposite direction from their actual flight. Swift Arrow led Catherine through narrow spaces between buildings, using the settlement's own structures as cover. His knowledge of the town's layout surprised her. He navigated with the confidence of someone who had studied each path and passage. They reached the edge of town, where Jenkins' general store stood dark and silent. Swift Arrow guided her to the back of the building, where a small shed housed surplus goods. He produced a slender piece of metal from a pouch at his waist and worked it into the lock with practiced ease. Inside, he closed the door soundlessly. Behind them, leaving them in total darkness, Catherine heard him moving with sure steps despite the lack of light, followed by the soft scrape of a trapdoor being lifted. "There is a space beneath," he whispered, his English accented but clear. "Used for storing winter goods in summer months. Empty now. Go." Catherine hesitated only briefly before lowering herself through the opening, finding an earthen-floored cellar about 4 feet high, enough to sit comfortably but not stand. Swift Arrow followed, pulling the trapdoor closed above them. A moment later, light bloomed as he struck a spark to a small tallow candle. In its dim glow, Catherine could finally see her rescuer clearly. His features were sharp and angular, with high cheekbones and a straight nose. The traditional markings painted across his face for their first encounter were gone now, revealing copper skin weathered by outdoor life. Only his eyes remained unchanged, dark, intense, and evaluating. "Why?" she asked, her voice a rasp after hours without water. "Why help me?" Swift Arrow reached for a water skin at his belt, offering it to her. As Catherine drank gratefully, he considered her question. "I watch settlement. For many days," he explained, his voice low but melodic. "See healer woman bring life, not death. See men bind you to tree of dying, not justice." Catherine wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, returning the water skin. "They believe I betrayed them, that I helped outlaws ambush a supply wagon and murder 3 men. Hampton's doing," Swift Arrow said, surprising her with his knowledge of the situation. "His men spread lies about Shawnee helping him. No Shawnee rides with Hampton." "You know of Hampton?" Catherine asked. Swift Arrow's expression hardened. "Moon ago, Hampton men attacked Shawnee hunting camp, killed 2 young hunters, burn shelters, take weapons." His hand moved unconsciously to a scar on his upper arm. "I have tracked since then, learn his ways, his places." Catherine's mind raced with implications. "Then there's no alliance between Hampton and your people, the Shawnee warrior with my medicine pouch." "No warrior," Swift Arrow interrupted. "Only lies from men who fear what they do not understand." A commotion outside interrupted their conversation. Voices approached the storage shed, accompanied by the glow of lanterns through the cracks in the wooden walls. "Could be in here," came Eli's voice, unnervingly close. "Check everywhere." Swift Arrow extinguished the candle with a quick pinch. In the sudden darkness, Catherine felt his hand find hers, steadying her as the shed door above rattled. For several tense heartbeats, they remained perfectly still as footsteps circled the small structure. "Doors locked from outside," another voice reported. "Couldn't have gotten in without a key." "Check the next building," Eli ordered, his voice already moving away. "Judge Harrison wants her found before dawn." Only when the lantern light had faded and footsteps retreated did Swift Arrow release her hand. They sat in darkness for several minutes longer, ensuring the search had truly moved on. "Why would Judge Harrison go to such lengths to frame me?" Catherine whispered. "What could he possibly gain?" Swift Arrow relit the candle, its small flame casting long shadows across his face. "Man who wears black robe speaks with Hampton 3 nights past." The revelation struck Catherine like a physical blow. "Harrison, you saw him meeting with Hampton." The warrior nodded. "At place where 3 rivers meet. Private words, gold changes hands." "You're certain it was Harrison?" Catherine pressed, the implications almost too enormous to comprehend. "Same man who bound you to a tree," Swift Arrow confirmed. Voice carries on the night air. "Spoke of taking care of the healer woman and securing the valley." Catherine sat back against the earthen wall, mind reeling. If Harrison was in league with Hampton, everything changed. The false evidence, her arrest, the public humiliation, all merely steps in some larger plan. "We need to find Marshal Williams," she decided, the pieces beginning to align in her mind. "If he's alive, he needs to know what's happening." Swift Arrow regarded her thoughtfully. "Marshal and men follow a false trail. Hampton led them north, away from the true camp, may already be dead." "I refuse to believe that," Catherine said firmly. "Daniel Williams has survived worse. We need to find him or find proof of Harrison's treachery that others will believe." A hint of respect flickered in Swift Arrow's eyes. "Woman bound to death tree speaks of fighting still. Courage runs deep." "Not courage," Catherine corrected, though his words warmed something within her. "Necessity. If Harrison controls Willow Creek, no one is safe. Not settlers, not your people." Swift Arrow was silent for a moment, considering. "Hampton Camp, hidden. In Black Bear Valley. 3 days' walk, many men with guns." "Why would a healer walk into an outlawed den?" he asked, with genuine curiosity in his voice. "Because that's where we'll find proof, and possibly Marshal Williams, if he tracked them that far." Catherine leaned forward, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "I've known Daniel Williams all my life. If anyone could survive an ambush and continue his mission, it's him." Swift Arrow studied her face in the candlelight, searching for something only he could recognize. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him. "First light we go," he decided. "Cannot move in darkness without leaving trail. Must rest now." Catherine nodded, suddenly aware of the bone-deep weariness that threatened to overcome her. The ordeal at the oak had drained her more than she realized. "What's your name?" she asked. "Your real name, not what others call you." The question seemed to surprise him. Few white settlers ever asked a native's true name, preferring to assign their own labels. "Hecla Mahawi," he answered after a moment. "In your tongue, Swift Arrow." "Thank you, Swift Arrow," Catherine said simply, "for believing I was worth saving." He didn't respond directly, but something shifted in his expression, a subtle softening around the eyes. He arranged his pack into a makeshift pillow and offered it. "To her, sleep," he advised. "Morning brings a long journey." Catherine accepted the pack gratefully, stretching out on the earthen floor. Despite the discomfort, exhaustion pulled her quickly toward unconsciousness. Her last waking thought was of the precision it must have taken to sever her bonds with. A single arrow in the darkness, a shot that seemed beyond human capability. Dawn had not yet broken when Swift Arrow gently shook Catherine awake. He had already prepared for their departure, packing the few supplies stored in his pouch and dousing any evidence of their presence. "Town stirs," he whispered. "Must move now, while eyes are still heavy with sleep." Catherine nodded, ignoring the protests of her stiff muscles as she rose to a crouch. Her wrists were raw and scabbed from the ropes, and her throat still felt parched despite the water Swift Arrow had shared. He led the way up through the trapdoor, pausing to listen intently before indicating it was safe to proceed. The storage. Shed was grey with pre-dawn light filtering through its wooden slats. Swift Arrow eased the door open a fraction, surveying the area. Satisfied, he motioned for Catherine to follow, leading her not toward the forest as she expected, but behind the row of buildings, toward the miller's pond at the eastern edge of town. A small rowboat was tied at a crude dock, used occasionally by children fishing during summer months. Swift Arrow untied it silently, holding it steady as Catherine climbed in. He pushed off with a single powerful stroke, sending the boat gliding out onto the still waters. The creek leads away from town, Catherine realized, as Swift Arrow paddled, with deliberate, noiseless strokes. You planned this escape route, he nodded without pausing his efforts. Water leaves no trail to follow. Creek joins the river below the valley. River takes us close to Black Bear Valley. As they rounded a bend, the settlement disappeared from view, hidden by a stand of willow trees that dropped low over the water. Only then did Catherine feel the tightness in her chest begin to ease. They had escaped, for now. The small craft moved steadily downstream as dawn broke fully over the valley. Birds began their morning chorus, and mist rose from the water's surface, providing additional cover as they traveled. We must leave the boat where the creek meets the river, Swift Arrow explained, his voice still low despite the distance they'd put between themselves and pursuit. Walk through forest to avoid river bends. Faster. Catherine nodded, gazing back toward the hills that concealed Willow Creek. Somewhere behind them, Harrison would be organizing a more thorough search. How long before he expanded it beyond the settlement boundaries? How many men would he send into the forest? Judge will blame Shawnee for taking you, Swift Arrow observed, following her gaze. Use fear to turn settlers against my people. That must be part of his plan, Catherine agreed, thinking aloud. Create conflict between settlers and Shawnee, perhaps to drive your people farther west. But why ally with Hampton? What does a circuit judge gain from partnering with an outlaw? Swift Arrow's expression remained impassive, but his eyes revealed understanding. Land where three rivers meet holds value beyond hunting. Yellow metal in streams, more where water cuts through. Stone. Gold! Catherine was stunned. There's gold in the valley? Small pieces but many. Shawnee have known for generations. Sacred place, not for taking. But white men's hunger for yellow metal burns hot. The pieces began to align in Catherine's mind. If there was gold in the territory, especially around the Three Rivers Junction, which lay within disputed boundaries between settlement land and Shawnee territory, Harrison's actions took on new meaning. He's using Hampton to create chaos, she reasoned, disrupting supply lines, sowing fear, turning settlers against the Shawnee. Also, he can claim the land where the gold is found. Swift Arrow nodded. Judge wears two faces, one for settlers to trust, one for Hampton to fear. The creek widened as they continued downstream, the current growing stronger. By mid-morning, they reached the junction where it flowed into the broader river that carved its way through the valley. Swift Arrow guided the boat to shore beneath overhanging branches and concealed it with fallen foliage. "From here, we walk," he announced, securing his bow across his back. Catherine stepped carefully onto the muddy bank, grateful for the sturdy boots she'd been wearing when arrested. They were practical, if not comfortable, for a long journey. "How far to Black Bear Valley?" she asked, orienting herself to the unfamiliar landscape. "2 suns, if moving fast," Swift Arrow replied. 3 of Hampton's men patrol borders." He set off into the forest with the confident stride of one who had traveled these paths countless times. Catherine followed, impressed by his ability to find the easiest route through seemingly impenetrable undergrowth. They walked in companionable silence, Swift Arrow occasionally pointing out useful plants or signs of wildlife. Despite the circumstances, Catherine found herself cataloguing medicinal herbs they passed, professional instinct overriding even her concerns about pursuit. By midday, they had covered significant ground, moving steadily northwest along game trails that offered faster progress than the meandering river. Swift Arrow called a brief halt near a small spring, where they refreshed themselves and ate sparingly from the pemmican he carried, a dense mixture of dried meat, fat, and berries that provided substantial energy. "You know these lands well," Catherine observed as they rested in the dappled shade of an ancient oak. Swift Arrow nodded. "These mountains, valleys, rivers, all Shawnee land for more seasons than can be counted. Every child learns paths, plants, and animals, how to move without being seen, how to live with the land, not against it." "My grandmother tried to teach me something similar," Catherine said, the memory bittersweet. "Before she returned to her Cherokee people in the South, my father encouraged it, even when others disapproved." Interest flickered in Swift Arrow's eyes. "Your blood carries Cherokee ways? This explains a lot." "What do you mean?" "How you walk." He indicated her footsteps, which left minimal disturbance compared to most settlers he'd observed. "How you watch forest with seeing eyes, not blind fear. How do you recognize plants that heal?" Catherine had never considered these traits as part of her heritage, rather than simply skills she'd developed. The observation gave her pause, a new perspective on aspects of herself she had taken for granted. Their contemplative moment was interrupted by distant voices carried on the wind, men calling to one another, moving through the forest with little attempt at stealth. Swift Arrow was on his feet instantly, bow in hand. "Search party," he whispered, gesturing for Catherine to remain still. "From settlement." Catherine froze, straining to hear. The voices were still distant but moving in their general direction, perhaps following the river as the most logical escape route. "They're casting a wide net," she murmured. "Harrison must have every able man searching." Swift Arrow assessed their position quickly. "Must change direction, move east toward high ridges, harder tracking, harder travel. They will not follow." "Far." Without waiting for a response, he set off at a brisk pace, angling away from the voices and toward the steeper terrain visible through the trees. Catherine followed, matching his urgency, aware that discovery now would mean not just her recapture, but likely death for Swift Arrow. The forest floor began to rise beneath their feet as they left the river valley, climbing toward the ridge that separates Willow Creek's territory from the wilderness beyond. The going became more difficult, the underbrush thicker, the slopes challenging even for Catherine's woods-trained steps. Swift Arrow moved with impressive agility, occasionally extending a hand to help her over particularly difficult passages. His touch was impersonal but sure, his strength evident in the ease with which he navigated terrain that would exhaust most men. By late afternoon, they had reached a vantage point that allowed them to look back over the valley they had crossed. Far below, barely visible through the trees, Catherine could make out small figures moving along the river, the search party continuing their hunt, unaware that their quarry had changed course. "They will search the river path until nightfall," Swift Arrow predicted. "Return to settlement when darkness comes. Begin again tomorrow, but with less certainty. And by then, we'll be well beyond their search area," Catherine concluded, allowing herself a moment of relief. Swift Arrow's expression remained watchful. "Judges will not abandon hunting easily. Too much at stake." He gestured toward the heights still above them. "We climb more before night. Sleep where eagles nest, safe from men who track by broken twigs." As they continued their ascent, Catherine found herself studying her unlikely companion with growing curiosity. He moved through the wilderness with a grace born of lifetime familiarity, yet his knowledge of the settlement suggested he had spent considerable time observing the white man's world. He spoke English better than many natives she had encountered, though his sentence structure remained distinctive. "How did you learn to speak English so well?" she asked as they paused to catch their breath on a rocky outcropping. A shadow passed over Swift Arrow's features. 7 winters as boy, taken to mission school. Christian men believe Shawnee children must learn white man's ways, white man's God, cut hair, beat language from tongue. The pain beneath his matter-of-fact recounting was evident to Catherine's perceptive ear. "You escaped?" He nodded. "3rd year, winter moon. Walked for 10 days to find my people again. Learned to be Shawnee twice, once as a child, once as a returning spirit." "But you kept the English," Catherine observed. "Knowledge is a weapon." Swift Arrow replied simply, "Understand enemies' words, understand enemies' thoughts. Do you see all settlers as enemies?" she asked, the question somehow important beyond their immediate circumstances. Swift Arrow was silent for a long moment, his gaze sweeping the vast landscape spread before them, the valleys and forests that had been Shawnee land since time immemorial, now increasingly claimed by cabins and fields. "Not all," he finally answered, his eyes returning to meet hers directly. "Some walk with respect, some listen before speaking, some heal instead of harm." The implication was clear in his steady gaze. Catherine felt something shift between them. In that moment, a recognition that transcended the barriers of their different worlds. Not friendship yet, perhaps, but the foundation for understanding. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they reached their destination, a sheltered hollow high on the ridge, protected by overhanging rock on 3 sides and offering a commanding view of the approaches. It was a natural fortress, invisible from below, but allowing its occupants to see any threat long before it arrived. Swift Arrow quickly created a small, nearly smokeless fire using dry wood and expert technique. The flames provided warmth without betraying their position to anyone watching from the valley below. "Rest," he instructed, offering Catherine another portion of pemmican. "Tomorrow we will change direction again. Circle back toward Black Bear, valley from east, where Hampton men do not watch." Catherine accepted the food gratefully, settling against the rock wall as twilight deepened around them. Below, the first stars reflected in the distant river, winding like a silver thread through the darkening valley. "Do you think Marshal Williams is still alive?" she asked quietly, voicing the concern that had lingered since their escape. Swift Arrow arranged his bow and quiver within easy reach before responding. "Man who teaches justice must be strong to survive in a world of lies. If he lives, we will find him. If spirits have taken him, we will honor his path by revealing the truth." His words offered neither false comfort nor despair, only a clear-eyed acceptance of possibilities and purpose. Catherine found strength in his pragmatism, a quality she had always valued in herself. As night fully claimed the mountain, Catherine gazed up at the vast canopy of stars, so much brighter here than they appeared from her cabin window. Somewhere beneath that same sky, Marshal Williams might be fighting his own battle against Harrison's betrayal. Somewhere, Hampton and his gang continued their reign of violence. And in Willow Creek, people she had known all her life now believed her a traitor. Yet here she sat, alive and free, because a Shawnee warrior had chosen to believe in her innocence and act on that belief with extraordinary skill. The impossible shot that had severed her bonds was just the beginning of a journey whose end remained hidden in the shadows of uncertainty. Tomorrow would bring them closer to answers, and quite possibly closer to danger than either could imagine. Morning. Light filtered through the trees as Catherine woke from a fitful sleep. The high ridge had provided safety, but the hard stone and cool mountain air had made rest elusive. She opened her eyes to find Swift Arrow already awake, perched at the edge of their shelter, scanning the valleys below with unwavering attention. "No hunters follow," he reported without turning. "Path clear." Catherine stretched her stiff limbs, wincing as the movement aggravated her rope-burned wrists. The crude bandages Swift Arrow had fashioned from strips of his buckskin shirt had helped, but the wounds would need proper cleaning soon to prevent infection. "Which way to Black Bear Valley from here?" she asked, joining him at the outlook. Swift Arrow pointed northwest, toward a distant range of mountains, barely visible through the morning mist. Beyond the third ridge, hidden place, few trails, many watchers. Hampton chose his hideout well, Catherine observed, mentally calculating the journey ahead. "How do we approach without being seen?" A ghost of a smile touched Swift Arrow's lips. "I teach you to walk like Shawnee." Silent feet, watchful eyes. They broke their makeshift camp quickly, Swift Arrow ensuring no trace remained of their presence. The fire was scattered and buried, the sleeping area swept clean of any human sign. Catherine watched his methodical process with growing appreciation for the woodcraft that had kept his people alive for generations. Their descent from the ridge took them through steeper terrain than their ascent had traversed. Swift Arrow led the way, occasionally demonstrating how to place feet on rocky surfaces to avoid dislodging stones that might alert hunters below to their presence. By midday, they had reached the valley floor again, though far east of their original path. Swift Arrow paused at a small creek, indicating they should refill the waterskin and rest briefly. "Hampton men patrol the borders of Black Bear Valley," he explained as they drank from the clear stream. "Guards on high points, watching. Trails. Then how do we get past them?" Catherine asked. "No one watches where no man can walk," Swift Arrow replied, pointing to a sheer cliff face visible through the trees. "We climb." Catherine studied the distant rock wall with growing apprehension. "I'm not sure path exists," he assured her. "Hidden from the valley floor, used by Shawnee hunters for generations. Difficult, but possible." They continued their journey, angling northwest toward the imposing cliff. As they walked, Swift Arrow began teaching Catherine the subtle art of moving silently through the forest. How to test each step before committing weight, how to part branches without causing them to snap back, how to recognize ground that would hold a footprint and ground that wouldn't. Catherine proved an apt pupil. Her Cherokee heritage and years of gathering medicinal herbs in the forest providing a foundation that Swift Arrow could build upon. By late afternoon, her passage had become noticeably quieter, though still far from the near, silenceless movement of her companion. The cliff loomed larger as they approached, its face streaked with ancient water stains and dotted with stubborn vegetation that clung to minimal footholds. Catherine couldn't imagine ascending it until Swift Arrow led her to a narrow fissure, nearly invisible from more than 20 paces away. "Path begins here," he said, entering the crack in the rock face. It widened into a natural staircase of sorts, worn by centuries of use and water erosion. The ascent was steep but manageable, though it required careful attention to handholds and balance. As they climbed higher, Catherine's admiration for native knowledge deepened. No settler would have discovered this route without specific guidance. Another reminder of how little they truly understood about the land they claimed to tame. Near the top, Swift Arrow paused, motioning for absolute stillness. Catherine froze, listening intently. After a moment, she detected what his sharper senses had already caught. Voices carried on the wind, men talking carelessly, secure in their isolation. "Hampton men," Swift Arrow whispered, barely audible even in the confined space. "Guard post, on the ridge above." He gestured for her to remain in place while he continued upward with extreme caution. Catherine watched as he ascended the final portion of the path, moving so deliberately that he seemed almost part of the rock itself. After what felt like an eternity, Swift Arrow reappeared, gesturing for her to join him. He led her onto a narrow ledge that skirted the guard position, keeping them below the sight line of the men above while providing a path forward. "2 men," he whispered as they carefully traversed the precarious route. "Rifles, whiskey, watch the main trail into the valley." The ledge eventually widened into a small plateau that offered their first view of Black Bear Valley spread below. Catherine's breath caught at the sight. The valley formed a natural bowl, ringed by steep cliffs and densely forested slopes. A small lake gleamed at its center, fed by mountain streams that converged in silver ribbons across the landscape. Near the lake's eastern shore stood a collection of crude cabins and tents, Hampton's hideout. Even from this distance, Catherine could make out the movement of men and horses, the thin spirals of cookfire smoke rising into the clear air. "More men than before," Swift Arrow observed, brow furrowing. 20, maybe 25, growing stronger. Catherine scanned the encampment, trying to discern any sign of Marshal Williams or his men. "Is there a place prisoners might be held?" Swift Arrow pointed to a cabin slightly separated from the others, positioned against the base of a rock formation. That place. No windows, heavy door, guards. "We need to get closer," Catherine decided. "See if the marshal or any of his men are being held there." Swift Arrow nodded, already studying potential approaches. "Wait for darkness. Stars will light our path, hide our shadows." They found shelter in a dense thicket of mountain laurel, positioned to keep watch on the camp while remaining hidden from both the guard post above and the valley below. As the afternoon waned, Catherine observed the patterns of movement in Hampton's hideout, men coming and going, changing of guards, delivery of food to the windowless cabin. "They're definitely guarding prisoners," she concluded, hope kindling in her chest. "Williams must be alive." Swift Arrow remained cautious. "Or holding someone valuable, maybe settler captives for ransom." As twilight descended, they ate sparingly from Swift Arrow's diminishing supplies. Catherine found herself studying her companion in the fading light, noting how his features seemed both hardened and softened by the approaching darkness, the warrior's vigilance never disappearing, yet something more contemplative emerged as, "The day yielded to night. You took great risk to free me," she said quietly. "Why?" Swift Arrow was silent for so long, Catherine thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a depth she hadn't heard before. "My grandfather was a great chief, respected by all Shawnee. When white settlers first came to our hunting grounds, he counseled peace. 'Watch and learn,' he told our warriors. 'Understand these new people before deciding if they are friends or enemies.'" Catherine listened, aware she was being granted access to something few settlers ever heard, the native perspective on their shared history. "Many winters, peace held," Swift Arrow continued. "Trade is good for both people. Then more settlers came, wanted not just trade, but land. My father became chief after my grandfather joined my ancestors. Still counseled patience, understanding. One day, white men came to the village while warriors hunted. Men with badges like marshals wear them. Said land now belonged to the government. My mother stood before our family lodge, refusing to leave. His voice remained steady, but Catherine saw his hand tighten on his knee. They shot her, said she attacked them. Lies. I watched from the trees. She held no weapon, spoke only truth. After these men wore two faces. One face told settlers, my mother was a dangerous savage. Other faces knew the truth but kept silent. Catherine felt the weight of his revelation, not just a story, but the key to understanding his actions. "And Judge Harrison reminded you of those men, those who wear two faces?" Swift Arrow nodded. "When I saw a healer woman bound to a tree for crimes not committed, I saw my mother again, saw justice twisted into a weapon, could not watch silently a second time." The simple explanation held more honor and courage than any elaborate justification could have conveyed. Catherine reached out, briefly touching his arm in silent acknowledgement of the gift he had given her in sharing this truth. As full darkness claimed the valley, Swift Arrow prepared for their dangerous descent. He blackened his face with charcoal. From their small fire, then did the same for Catherine, explaining that even pale skin could catch moonlight and betray their presence. "Follow exactly," he instructed, checking his weapons. "Bow, knife, and tomahawk. Step where I step. Breathe when I breathe." Catherine nodded, her heart beginning to pound with anticipation and fear. This was far beyond anything in her experience, yet she felt no hesitation. If Marshal Williams lived, he deserved their best effort to reach him. They began their descent via a different route than their ascent, a game trail so narrow and steep that Catherine had to fight vertigo on several occasions. Swift Arrow moved with absolute confidence, occasionally extending a hand backward to steady her on particularly treacherous sections. The journey to the valley floor took nearly 2 hours, moving with painful slowness to ensure silence. Once they reached level ground, Swift Arrow directed them into the deeper shadows of the forest that surrounded the lake, circling wide to approach the camp from the least guarded direction. As they drew closer, the details of Hampton's operation became clearer. Men moved between buildings, carrying crates and saddlebags. A corral on the western edge held at least 30 horses, far more than needed for the men Catherine had counted, suggesting Hampton expected reinforcements or planned significant raids. The cabin Swift Arrow had identified as a potential prison stood slightly apart, as he'd noted from above. 2 armed men guarded its door, looking bored but alert. No light showed from within, though occasional movement of the guards suggested they were responding to sounds from inside. Swift Arrow touched Catherine's arm, directing her attention to a small stream that ran close to the rear of the cabin. It emerged from a spring in the rock face behind the structure and offered both cover and a path of approach. Using every technique Swift Arrow had taught her, Catherine followed him through the underbrush toward the stream. They crawled the final 100 yards, moving inches at a time when guards might be looking in their direction, freezing into absolute stillness whenever voices or footsteps approached too near. Finally, they reached the stream bed behind the cabin, concealed by a combination of darkness and the natural depression in the earth. Swift Arrow gestured for Catherine to remain in place while he crept closer to the structure, examining its construction with a hunter's eye for weakness. When he returned, he signaled that they should move upstream, where the water coursed closer, to the cabin's foundation. There, partially hidden by a stunted willow, they discovered what Swift Arrow had suspected, a small ventilation gap where the rough-hewn logs didn't quite meet the ground. Catherine lay flat, pressing her ear to the opening. At first, she heard nothing but the soft gurgle of the nearby stream, then a cough, distinctly human, followed by the clink of metal on metal. Chains, perhaps, or shackles. "Someone's alive in there," she whispered, her lips nearly touching. "Swift Arrow's ear." He nodded, then gestured for her to try to see inside. Catherine positioned her eye to the narrow gap, allowing it to adjust to the deeper darkness within. Gradually, shapes emerged, the earthen floor, a wooden post in the center of the room, and against it, a seated figure, head slumped forward. She couldn't make out details in the gloom, but the broad shoulders and posture seemed familiar. Hope surged within her. "Marshal," she called softly, barely above her breath. The figure stirred, head lifting slightly. "Who's there?" came a hoarse whisper. "Daniel." William's voice, though weakened and rough with thirst. "It's Catherine Harlow," she replied, relief washing through her. "We've come to help you." There was a long pause, then, "Catherine? How in God's name—" "There's no time to explain," she interrupted. "Are you alone?" "No. Finch and Lawson are here too, though Lawson's in bad shape. Took a bullet during the ambush." Catherine glanced at Swift Arrow, who had been listening intently. 3 men, she summarized, 1 wounded, all inside. Swift Arrow considered this information, eyes calculating distances, scanning the camp's layout. "Guards change at the moon's highest point," he observed. "Fewer men awake, best time." "Marshal," Catherine whispered through the gap, "we'll come back for you tonight when the camp is quieter. Can you be ready to move?" Been ready since they dragged us in here, Williams answered, a hint of his usual determination returning to his voice. But Catherine, you need to know, Hampton isn't working alone. Judge Harrison, we know, she interrupted. That's why I'm here. Harrison had me arrested, claiming I was working with Hampton. A soft curse escaped the marshal's lips. The judge arrived here yesterday. Private meeting with Hampton in the main cabin. Something big is happening soon. Swift Arrow tensed beside her, his hand closing around her wrist in warning. Catherine fell silent as footsteps approached the cabin, heavy boots crunching on gravel. They pressed themselves flat against the earth as a guard circled the structure, passing barely 3 feet from their position. Only when the footsteps had receded did Swift Arrow signal it was safe to continue. Must go, he whispered. Return when darkness deepens. Marshal, Catherine called softly. We'll be back. Hold on. Be careful, Williams responded. Hampton's doubled his men. Something's coming tomorrow. Didn't catch what, but it's big. With that final warning, Catherine and Swift Arrow retreated, retracing their path along the stream before circling back toward the forested slopes that surrounded the valley. They needed a secure place to wait for the optimal moment and to plan. Their approach. Swift Arrow led her to a dense thicket halfway up the eastern slope, positioned to observe the camp while remaining hidden from any patrols. As they settled into their temporary shelter, Catherine's mind raced with the implications of William's warning. What could Hampton be planning that requires so many men? She wondered aloud, keeping her voice to the barest whisper. Swift Arrows. Expression was grim in the filtered moonlight. Judge spoke of securing the valley when meeting Hampton. Perhaps the final move is to take land where rivers meet. But that would require... Catherine stopped, the horrifying realization dawning. A massacre. They're planning to attack the Shawnee village. Swift Arrow nodded, having reached the same conclusion. Frame Shawnee for attacks on settlers. Create fear, anger. Then strike at the village while warriors defend against false charges. And with the Shawnee gone, Harrison can claim the territory with the gold deposits, Catherine finished, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. We need to warn your people. Cannot leave Marshall and his men to die, Swift Arrow countered. Need their witness to Harrison's treachery. Settlers will not believe Shawnee alone. Catherine recognized the impossible choice before them, save the captives or warn the village. Either decision left innocents in danger. What if we split up? She suggested. I could free the marshal while you warn your people. Swift Arrow shook his head. Too dangerous alone. Hampton men would capture you again. Catherine considered their limited options. What if we free the marshal first, then all of us go to warn the village? With William's testimony, we might convince some of the settlers to help defend the Shawnee. After careful deliberation, they agreed on Catherine's plan. They would wait until the camp was at its quietest, typically the hours after midnight, when even the most dedicated revelers had succumbed to exhaustion or alcohol. As they waited, Catherine used the time to prepare. She tore strips from her petticoat to serve as bandages for Lawson's wound. Swift Arrow fashioned 3 additional arrows with specially designed heads, broad cutting edges designed to sever rope or chain links when struck with sufficient force. Like the arrow that freed me, Catherine observed, watching his skilled hands work in the dim light. Freedom arrows, he confirmed. Sharp enough to cut iron if shot true. Catherine marveled at the precision such a shot would require, hitting a chain link or rope without striking the prisoner it bound. You truly are remarkable with that bow. Swift Arrow continued his work, but Catherine caught the slight nod of acknowledgement. Pride in one's skills wasn't a sin in Shawnee culture, as it sometimes seemed to be in the Christian teachings she'd grown up with. My grandfather began teaching when I could first hold a bow, he explained, testing the edge of an arrowhead with his thumb, Said some children born with a gift for certain weapons. My hands knew the bow before they knew other tools. As midnight approached, they observed the changing of the guards around the prisoner cabin. The fresh sentries looked less attentive than their predecessors, one frequently drinking from a flask, while the other struggled to keep his eyes open. Soon, Swift Arrow decided, when the moon passes behind the mountain. Catherine nodded mentally. Reviewing their plan, Swift Arrow would eliminate the guards silently if possible. They would free the captives, arm them with whatever weapons they could secure, and escape via the game trail that led northeast, the opposite direction from Hampton's expected attack route. The minutes stretched endlessly as they waited for the precise moment. Catherine found herself studying Swift Arrow's profile in the darkness, the strong lines of his face reflecting generations of his people's connection to this land. She wondered what he saw when he looked at her. A settler, an ally, or something else entirely. Finally, the moon slipped behind the mountain ridge, casting the valley into a deeper shadow. Swift Arrow rose silently, checking his weapons one final time. Catherine stood beside him, drawing strength from his quiet confidence. They descended the slope with painful slowness, every movement calculated to avoid detection. The stillness of the valley was broken only by the occasional snort of horses in the corral and the distant hooting of an owl. As they approached the edge of the clearing where Hampton's camp sprawled, Swift Arrow suddenly raised his hand in the signal to stop. Catherine froze, straining her senses to detect what had alerted him. Voices drifted from the direction of the main cabin, men speaking in urgent tones. A door opened, spilling lamplight onto the packed earth outside. 3 figures emerged, their features thrown into sharp relief by the yellow glow. Catherine recognized Hampton immediately, a bear of a man with a bushy beard and cold eyes that had terrorized the region for months. Beside him stood Judge Harrison, his judicial robes replaced by practical frontier clothing, but his authoritative bearing unchanged. The third figure made Catherine's blood run cold. Edward Prescott, the supposed victim of the ambush, whose testimony had condemned her. He showed no sign of the wound she had treated, walking with the confident stride of a man who had never been injured. Swift Arrow's grip on her arm tightened as the men approached the prisoner cabin, stopping to speak with the guards. Something was happening, a change in plans that threatened to unravel their rescue attempt before it began. The cabin door opened, and 2 more of Hampton's men emerged, dragging a figure between them. Marshal Williams, barely conscious, his face bruised and bloody. Harrison stepped forward, saying something too low to hear from their position. Whatever it was caused Hampton to laugh, a sound devoid of genuine humor. With horrifying clarity, Catherine and Swift Arrow watched as the men forced Williams to his knees beside the cabin. Harrison produced a document from his coat, reading it aloud in official tones that carried across the silent camp. Though they couldn't make out every word, the formal cadence suggested a mockery of a legal proceeding. A trial, Catherine whispered, horror mounting. They're conducting a false trial. Swift Arrow notched an arrow, his body tensing with the instinct to intervene. Catherine placed a restraining hand on his arm, knowing that a shot now would doom not only Williams but the other captives and themselves as well. We need a different plan, she urged. There are too many of them awake now. With visible effort, Swift Arrow lowered his bow. Not trial, he said grimly. Execution. Even as he spoke, Harrison finished reading and folded the paper with the practiced flourish of his courtroom manner. Hampton stepped forward, drawing his pistol and placing it against the back of Williams's head. Catherine's mind raced desperately for a solution. They couldn't attack directly. They were hopelessly outnumbered. They couldn't retreat. Williams would die. What they needed was a distraction, something to throw the camp into confusion and give them an opening. Her gaze fell on the corral where Hampton's horses were kept. Fire would cause panic, but she couldn't bear the thought of the animals suffering. Then she spotted the solution, a stack of powder kegs outside the supply tent, positioned dangerously close to a smoldering campfire. "There," she whispered, pointing. "If you could hit one of those kegs with a fire arrow." Swift Arrow followed her gaze, instantly understanding. Without a word, he reached into his quiver and extracted an arrow, quickly wrapping its head with a strip of buckskin. From a pouch at his waist, he produced a small ember bundle. Specially prepared material that could hold fire for hours, used by his people to transport flame between camps. He touched the ember to the buckskin, which caught quickly. Drawing his bow, Swift Arrow took careful aim not at the kegs themselves, but at the dry grass beside them. A direct hit might only punch a hole in the keg without igniting the powder, but grass fire would spread to the wooden kegs. Eventually, reaching the powder within, the flaming arrow flew true, landing precisely where he'd aimed. Within seconds, the dry grass was burning steadily, flames licking toward the powder kegs. "Now we move," Swift Arrow directed, already circling toward the prisoner cabin from the opposite side of the growing distraction. As they had hoped, shouts of alarm rose from the camp as someone spotted the fire. Men rushed toward the blaze, Hampton and Harrison among them, momentarily forgetting their prisoner in the face of the more immediate threat. The guards hesitated, torn between their duty to watch Williams and the urge to help contain what could become a catastrophic explosion. Their indecision gave Swift Arrow the opening he needed. 2 swift arrows found their marks with deadly precision, and the guards fell without raising the alarm. Catherine and Swift Arrow rushed forward as Williams struggled to his feet, disoriented but alive. "Marshal," Catherine whispered urgently, supporting his weight. "We need to move quickly. Where are Finch and Lawson?" "Still inside," Williams managed, his voice ragged. "Chained to the wall." Swift Arrow moved immediately to the cabin door, finding it barred from the outside. He lifted the heavy wooden beam and eased the door open, bow ready. Inside, the remaining deputies were indeed chained to iron rings set into the log walls. Finch looked up in shock as Swift Arrow entered, followed by Catherine supporting the "Marshal, what in God's name?" Finch began. "No time," Catherine cut him off. "We need to free you and get out before—" Her words were interrupted by a tremendous explosion as the fire finally reached the powder kegs. The ground shook beneath them, and shouts of pain and confusion filled the night air. Swift Arrow moved swiftly to the men's chains, examining the locks. "Cannot pick these," he decided. "Stand back." With practiced efficiency, he notched one of his specially designed arrows and fired at point-blank range into the chain link securing Finch. The arrow's reinforced head struck with enough force to snap the weakest link, freeing the deputy's hands. For Lawson, who lay unconscious with a crudely bandaged shoulder wound, Swift Arrow repeated the procedure. Catherine quickly checked the injured man's pulse, finding it weak but steady. "He needs immediate medical attention," she told Williams, who was recovering his strength with each passing moment. "First, we need to get out of here alive," the marshal replied grimly. "Hampton has at least 20 men in this camp." Outside, the chaos continued as men battled the spreading fire. Swift Arrow led them to the rear of the cabin, where they had first made contact through the ventilation gap. "Stream leads to forest," he explained. "Water hides footprints." They moved as quickly as Lawson's condition allowed, Williams and Finch carrying their wounded comrade between them. Catherine brought up the rear, watching for pursuit, while Swift Arrow scouted ahead, ensuring their path remained clear. The cold water of the stream numbed Catherine's feet as they waded upstream, away from the camp and toward the protective darkness of the forest. Behind them, the fire had spread to a second tent, and men shouted contradictory orders as Hampton's disciplined operation devolved into panicked confusion. They had covered perhaps 200 yards when a voice rang out. Behind them, there, in the stream, Catherine turned to see Edward Prescott standing on the bank, rifle raised. "Run!" she shouted to the others, dropping to the streambed as Prescott fired. The bullet struck water inches from her position, sending up a spray that momentarily blinded her. Before Prescott could reload, an arrow whistled through the darkness, striking him in the shoulder and spinning him to the ground. Swift Arrow materialized beside Catherine, pulling her to her feet. "More coming," he warned. "Must reach trees." With renewed urgency, they splashed through the stream toward the forest edge. 2 more shots rang out behind them, but the darkness and their moving targets thwarted the shooters' aim. Finally, they reached the tree line, Swift Arrow guiding them onto a nearly invisible path that wound upward through the dense undergrowth. Only when they had climbed well above the valley floor did he call a halt, finding a defensible position behind a fallen log where they could rest momentarily. "They'll organize a search party," Williams predicted. His breathing labored from the exertion. "But they won't find this trail in the dark." Finch lowered Lawson gently to the ground, allowing Catherine to examine his wound more thoroughly. "Will he make it?" the young deputy asked, concern evident in his voice. The bullet passed clean. "Through," Catherine determined after careful inspection. "But infection has set in. He needs medicine I don't have here." Swift Arrow, who had been watching the valley below, turned to join their discussion. "My village has medicine, strong against wound fire." "Your village?" Williams questioned, eyeing the Shawnee warrior with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "You're proposing we seek refuge with the Shawnee?" "Not just refuge," Catherine explained quickly. "Hampton and Harrison are planning to attack the village tomorrow. We need to warn them, and we need your testimony about Harrison's involvement to convince the settlers not to join the attack." Williams absorbed this information with growing anger. Harrison betrayed everything he swore to uphold: the law, the people's trust. "Yellow metal blinds many men to honor," Swift Arrow observed, "makes them forget the difference between right and wrong." The marshal nodded grimly. "Gold can corrupt even the best of men, and Harrison was far from the best to begin with." They prepared to continue their journey. Catherine found herself standing beside Swift Arrow at the edge of their temporary shelter, looking out over the valley where fires still burned in Hampton's disrupted camp. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Again." Swift Arrow studied her face in the mixed light of stars and distant flames. "Healer women have courage like Shawnee warriors," he replied simply. "Make an arrow fly true to help such spirit." His words carried a respect that transcended their different worlds, an acknowledgement that courage and honor belonged to no single people or tradition. In that moment, Catherine realized their partnership had evolved beyond reluctant allies facing a common enemy. Something deeper now bound them together, a mutual recognition of qualities each valued most highly. Below them, Hampton's men had organized lantern-bearing search parties that spread outward from the camp like ripples in a pond. But the searchers focused on the obvious paths and clear terrain, never thinking to look for the nearly invisible trail that would lead them to a Shawnee village and an alliance that neither side could have imagined days before. As they gathered their strength for the journey ahead, Catherine knew that warning the village was only the beginning. The greater challenge would be convincing 2 mistrustful communities to overcome generations of prejudice and unite against the true enemies of justice and peace. Swift Arrow seemed to read her thoughts. "Difficult path ahead," he observed. "Not just through forest, but through minds closed by fear." "Then we'll have to open them," Catherine replied with quiet determination. "One mind at a time, if necessary." Marshal Williams, overhearing their exchange, joined them at the outlook. "I've upheld the law in this territory for 15 years, he said. "My word still carries weight with most of the settlers. If we can get back to Willow Creek before Harrison returns, we might just have a chance to prevent this from becoming the bloodbath he's planning. Swift Arrow turned to face the eastern horizon, where the faintest lightning suggested dawn was not far off. Then we travel now, he decided, while stars still light our path. Together, the unlikely allies gathered their wounded companion and set off into the darkness, racing against time to prevent a massacre and expose a corruption that threatened to destroy everything each of them held dear. Dawn painted the eastern sky with streaks of gold and crimson as Catherine, Swift Arrow, and the lawman crested the final ridge, separating them from the Shawnee village. The journey had been arduous, steep terrain, and Deputy Lawson's deteriorating condition forcing frequent stops. Swift Arrow had ranged ahead and behind, ensuring no pursuit followed from Hampton's camp. Now, as they gazed down at the village nestled along the banks of a small river, Marshal Williams hesitated. No white lawman has ever entered there and left a tell of it, he said quietly. Catherine understood his reservation. The Shawnee had maintained this village as their last secure haven, a place where settlers were unwelcome and unknown. They will not harm those who come with warning and truth, Swift Arrow assured them, though his eyes reflected concern of a different kind. But my people have heard many false promises. Words alone will not convince them. The village consisted of about 30 structures, a mix of traditional longhouses and smaller dwellings arranged in a rough circle around a central council fire. Even at this early hour, activity was evident as women tended morning fires and children carried water from the river. How do we approach it? Catherine asked. We don't want to cause alarm. Swift Arrow considered for a moment before removing the hawk feather from his hair. He handed it to Catherine. You will carry this, symbol that you come under my protection. I will go first, speak to elders, then signal when safe to approach. Before Catherine could respond, he vanished into the forest, moving with such fluid grace that even knowing his direction, she lost sight of him within seconds. Remarkable man, Williams commented, easing Lawson into a more comfortable position against a fallen log. Never thought I'd owe my life to a Shawnee warrior. We've all been too quick to judge those different from ourselves, Catherine replied, gently checking Lawson's wound. The infection was spreading, his skin hot to the touch despite the cool morning air. Finch, the younger deputy, had remained mostly silent during their journey, processing the betrayal by a judge he had respected. Now he voiced the concern that had clearly been troubling him. Even if the Shawnee believe us, will the settlement? Harrison has been turning against them for months. Against you too, Catherine. Truth has power, she answered, though doubt shadowed her certainty, especially when delivered by a respected voice like the Marshal's. Williams adjusted his torn shirt, attempting to restore some semblance of his official appearance. Harrison's influence runs deep, but not as deep as the people's desire for peace. No one wants a war with the Shawnee, not farmers with families to protect, not merchants who profit from trade. Their discussion was interrupted by movement in the village. Below, Swift Arrow had emerged from the trees and approached the central fire, where several elders now gathered. Even at this distance, the intensity of the conversation was evident in the gestures and postures of those assembled. More warriors appeared, some clearly returning from hunting parties, others emerging from dwellings. Weapons were much in evidence: bows, tomahawks, and even a few rifles acquired through trade. They're mobilizing, Williams observed. Swift Arrow's warning is being taken seriously. After what seemed an endless wait, Swift Arrow turned toward the ridge and raised his arm in a clear signal to approach. Catherine secured the hawk feather to her sleeve as instructed and helped Williams get Lawson to his feet. Remember, she cautioned as they began their descent, we come seeking alliance, not dominance. Follow my lead. The reception awaiting them at the village edge was hardly welcoming. A line of warriors with expressionless faces, weapons held. ready but not threateningly. Swift Arrow stood with the village elders, his posture respectful but insistent as he continued speaking in his native tongue. An old man stepped forward, his face deeply lined with age and wisdom. His attire marked him as someone of great importance, elaborately beaded buckskins and a headdress featuring eagle feathers and bear claws. When he spoke, it was surprisingly in English, though heavily accented. "I am Grey Fox, chief of this band. Swift Arrow says you bring warning of attack. Says a judge of white law plans great evil against Shawnee alongside an outlaw called Hampton." Catherine stepped forward, bowing her head respectfully. "I am Catherine Harlow, healer from Willow Creek. This is Marshal Daniel Williams, who upholds true law, not the false justice Harrison has corrupted. We come to warn you and to seek your help in stopping those who would destroy both our peoples for their greed." The chief studied her face with penetrating intensity before shifting his gaze to Williams and the injured deputies. "Healer woman and lawman allied with Shawnee tracker. Strange days indeed." He gestured toward Lawson. "Your man carries wound, fire in his blood." "He was shot during Hampton's ambush," Catherine explained. "The infection spreads quickly. I've done what I can, but—" Grey Fox nodded to one of the women standing nearby, speaking a few words in Shawnee. She disappeared into a dwelling, returning moments later with a small bundle of herbs and roots. "Medicine women will tend your wounds," Grey Fox announced. "Then we will counsel. Much must be decided before the sun reaches its highest point." Lawson was taken to a small lodge at the village edge, where the Shawnee medicine woman began treating. His infection with a poultice of crushed herbs that filled the air with a pungent, earthy scent. Catherine observed with professional interest, recognizing some ingredients while others remained mysterious to her. "Your grandmother taught you some of our ways," the medicine woman commented in broken English, noting Catherine's knowledgeable gaze. "But many secrets remain with tribal healers alone. My grandmother was Cherokee," Catherine explained. "Some remedies cross tribal boundaries, I think." The woman nodded approvingly. "All healers serve the same spirits, though names differ. This man will live if strength remains in his heart." While Lawson received treatment, Williams and Finch were guided to the council fire where village elders had assembled. Catherine joined them, sitting beside Swift Arrow as Grey Fox called the gathering to order. Williams recounted the ambush that had led to his capture, Hampton's alliance with Harrison, and the mock trial that had nearly ended in his execution. When he described the plans to attack the village, murmurs of anger rippled through the assembly. "Judge Harrison tells settlers Shawnee work with Hampton," Swift Arrow translated for those who didn't speak English. "Claims we help kill white families, steal goods. All lies to make settlers hate us, support attack." "Why would the judge want Shawnee land?" asked a younger warrior. "Many better places to grow white man's corn." "Not for farming," Catherine explained. "For gold. Swift Arrow says there are deposits where the three rivers meet, land that belongs to your people by treaty." Grey Fox's expression remained impassive, though something flickered in his eyes. "Gold has been known to Shawnee for generations. We leave it on earth where the Creator placed it. Taking it brings only suffering." "Harrison doesn't share that wisdom," Williams said grimly. "He's willing to orchestrate a massacre to claim those deposits." The council debated in Shawnee for several minutes, voices occasionally rising in disagreement. Catherine couldn't follow the specifics, but the division was clear. Some advocating immediate evacuation of the village, others insisting they should fight to defend their ancestral land. Finally, Grey Fox raised his hand for silence. "When does Hampton plan to attack?" he asked Williams. "Today, according to what we overheard. They'll likely wait until afternoon when they've regrouped after our escape." The chief considered this information, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. "And what do you propose, Marshal? That we abandon our homes, or that we fight and die defending land that treaties already promise us? Treaties your people ignore when convenient?" The question hung in the air, challenging Williams to offer more than sympathetic words. Catherine held her breath, understanding that everything depended on the Marshal's answer. Williams straightened, meeting the chief's gaze directly. "I propose we stop Harrison and Hampton before they can launch their attack. Not just Shawnee warriors, but together, your braves fighting alongside men from Willow Creek who still believe in justice." Skeptical glances passed among the elders. "Why would settlers fight against their own kind to protect Shawnee?" one asked. "Because Harrison has betrayed everyone," Catherine interjected. "He framed me, a healer born in their community. He conspired with outlaws who have terrorized settler families. He arranged the ambush of a supply wagon carrying medicine children needed. His crimes aren't just against your people, but against everyone in the valley." Swift Arrow nodded in agreement. "Many in the settlement have good hearts behind fearful eyes. Will listen to the Marshal's words if given the chance. And if they don't," Grey Fox challenged, "if they choose Hampton's lies over your truth, then at least you'll have warning and time to evacuate the most vulnerable," Williams answered. "Honestly. But I have to believe truth can prevail if given a voice." The council continued its deliberations while Catherine, Williams and Finch waited anxiously. Swift Arrow occasionally translated key points, but much remained unclear as the discussion grew increasingly animated. Eventually, Grey Fox called for a decision. One by one the elders spoke, some at length, others with just a few words. When all had voiced their thoughts, the chief turned back to the visitors. "We have decided. Half our warriors will accompany you to the settlement, hidden in the forest edge. If your words turn settler hearts, we fight together against Harrison and Hampton. If words fail, our warriors will defend the village, while others lead women, children and elders to winter hunting grounds in the North Valley." It wasn't the unqualified alliance Catherine had hoped for, but given generations of broken trust, it represented remarkable faith in their mission. "We should leave immediately," Williams urged. "We need to reach Willow Creek before Hampton and Harrison can return and spread more lies." Grey Fox nodded to Swift Arrow. "You will lead our warriors. Choose those with the coolest heads and the surest hands." As Swift Arrow went to select his companions, Catherine sought out the medicine woman to check on Lawson's condition. "Fever breaks," the healer announced with quiet satisfaction. "Sleep now. Strength returns slowly. Cannot travel today." "We can't. Leave him here alone," Finch protested. "He will not be alone," Grey Fox assured them, having followed Catherine. "2 of our elders remain to tend wounded and prepare others for a possible journey north. Your man will be cared for as one of our own." Catherine recognized the gesture of trust this represented, leaving one of their own in Shawnee hands while they returned to rally the settlement. "Thank you," she said simply. "We won't forget this kindness." Preparations moved swiftly after that. Swift Arrow selected 12 warriors, men he vouched for as level-headed and disciplined. They would shadow the group's return to Willow Creek, remaining hidden until called upon. As Catherine prepared to depart, the medicine woman approached, pressing a small leather pouch into her hands. "For healing," she explained, "strong medicine for wounded spirit as well as body." The small gift symbolized something profound, recognition between healers that transcended the boundaries of their different worlds. Catherine tucked it carefully into her pocket, a talisman of the unexpected bridge being built between communities. By mid-morning, their unusual company set out from the village, Catherine, Williams and Finch openly on the trail, while Swift Arrow and his chosen warriors moved like shadows through the forest parallel to their path. They would reach Willow Creek by early afternoon if they maintained a steady pace. As they walked, Williams outlined their approach. "We'll gather people at the town square, the same place where they bound you to that oak, Catherine. Fitting that it should be where the truth finally comes to light. And if Harrison's men try to stop us? Finch asked, the youngest and most anxious of their party. Deputy Collins has never supported Harrison's methods, Williams replied. If we can speak with him first, convince him of what we've learned, he may stand with us rather than against us. Catherine's thoughts turned to the townspeople she had known all her life, people who had watched her bound to the hanging tree without protest. Would they listen now? Or had Harrison's poison spread too deeply? Swift Arrow appeared beside them so suddenly that Finch reached reflexively for his missing sidearm. The Shawnee warrior's expression was troubled as he pointed to a thin column of smoke rising above the trees in the direction of Willow Creek. Fire in settlement, he reported. Many men are moving on the main trail ahead. Hampton's riders, Williams swore under his breath. They're moving faster than we expected, they're pushed toward the village already, or creating a diversion in town to empty it of defenders before the real attack. Catherine suggested, fear gripping her heart. We need to hurry. They quickened their pace, Swift Arrow disappearing once more to scout ahead, while his warriors maintained their protective formation around the exposed travelers. The smoke column thickened as they drew nearer to Willow Creek, suggesting not just a single structure burning, but a larger conflagration. When they created the final hill overlooking the settlement, the sight that greeted them confirmed their worst fears. The jail and marshal's office were engulfed in flames, as was the courthouse. Armed men on horseback, unmistakably Hampton's gang, patrolled the streets while terrified townsfolk huddled in the square, guarded by more outlaws. In the center of it all, Judge Harrison stood on a hastily constructed platform beside the Willow Creek oak, addressing the captive audience with grand gestures. Even from this distance his voice carried, speaking of Shawnee savagery and the need for decisive action to secure our future. They've taken the town, Williams said in disbelief. Harrison's staging a coup before launching his attack on the village. Swift Arrow materialized beside them, his expression grim. More riders coming from the West Road. Hampton himself leads them. Catherine stared at the scene below, the full horror of Harrison's plan becoming clear. He's gathering everyone in town to witness his version of events. Once Hampton arrives with evidence of a Shawnee attack, panic will do the rest. They'll have their army of settlers marching against your village by nightfall. Not if we expose him first, Williams declared, his hand unconsciously moving to where his gun would normally rest. How? Finch demanded. We're outnumbered, outgunned, and they control the town. Catherine's eyes never left the great oak where she had been chained, where Harrison now stood spreading his poison. The symmetry was undeniable. Her public humiliation and now his public deception, both centered on the same ancient tree that had witnessed generations of the valley's history. Swift Arrow, she said softly, an idea forming. How far can you shoot an arrow and still hit a precise target? The Shawnee warrior followed her gaze to the distant platform. From forest edge to great oak, difficult shot but possible. And could one of your arrows carry my voice to those people? Could it deliver the truth as clearly as it delivered my freedom? Understanding dawned in Swift Arrow's eyes. Arrow of truth instead of arrow of death. Yes. This I can do. As Hampton's riders approached the town from the west, Catherine outlined her desperate plan, a plan that would require perfect timing, unshakable courage, and the most important shot Swift Arrow had ever taken. The forest edge provided their last cover before the exposed ground that surrounded Willow Creek. From this vantage point, Catherine, Williams, and their allies could see the full extent of Harrison's takeover. Hampton's men had positioned themselves strategically throughout the settlement, on rooftops, at street corners, and prominently around the town square where the residents had been gathered. They've got at least 30 men, Williams assessed, grimly. Armed and ready for trouble. Swift Arrow had dispatched his warriors in a wide arc around the settlement, positioned to respond when needed but hidden from hostile eyes. Now he crouched beside Catherine, both studying Judge Harrison as he continued addressing the captive townspeople. "What exactly do you plan to shoot?" Williams asked, eyeing the small parchment Catherine had produced from her medicine pouch. "Evidence. That can't be ignored," she replied, carefully unfolding the paper. It was a land deed, one she had discovered among her father's effects after his death, but had never fully understood its significance until now. "This is the original treaty map showing the boundary of Shawnee territory, signed by territorial representatives and tribal leaders. My father witnessed it as the settlement's doctor." Swift Arrow's eyes widened slightly as he recognized the document. The speaking paper that marks true boundaries. Thought lost when the first marshal died. "Harrison's entire claim depends on disputing the treaty boundaries," Catherine explained. "This proves the gold deposits lie squarely in protected Shawnee land. He's known this all along. It's why he needed to create conflict, to void the treaty through supposed Shawnee aggression." Williams studied the document. "This alone won't stop him. He'll claim it's forged or outdated." "Not if we accompany it with testimony the town can't ignore," Catherine countered. "This is just to get their attention. You'll provide the truth. They need to hear." Swift Arrow nodded slowly, understanding her strategy. Arrow carries paper. Marshall carries words. Both strike at the heart of lies. Their planning was interrupted by commotion from the town square. Hampton and his main force had arrived, riding directly to the platform where Harrison waited. The outlaw leader carried something draped across his saddle, a blood-stained blanket wrapped around objects that he displayed dramatically to the horrified crowd. "Shawnee weapons," Swift Arrow murmured, his keen eyes picking out details at this. "Distance. Covered in blood to suggest an attack." Williams swore softly. "The staging is beginning. They'll claim to have found evidence of Shawnee raiders preparing to massacre the settlement." Catherine watched as Harrison seized upon Hampton's arrival, his voice rising with practiced courtroom authority. Though they couldn't hear every word, the performance was clear. Harrison portraying himself as the settlement's savior, the only man who had recognized the savage threat and taken action to protect innocent lives. "We need to move now," Catherine decided, "before they whip the crowd into a frenzy." Swift Arrow prepared his bow, selecting a special arrow from his quiver, one with a flattened head designed to carry small objects. Catherine carefully rolled the treaty map into a tight cylinder, securing it with a strip of buckskin before attaching it to the arrow shaft. "I'll approach from the south edge of the square," Williams outlined, checking that Finch understood his role. "Once the arrow strikes and people are distracted, I'll make my way to the platform. Catherine, you circle around to the general store. Jenkins will protect you if needed." Catherine nodded, though her heart raced at the thought of showing herself to men who had bound her to the hanging tree. "What about Swift Arrow?" "I follow a shadow path," the Shawnee warrior replied. "Unseen until needed. Warriors await my signal from the forest edge." With their plans set, they prepared for what might be their only chance to prevent bloodshed. Catherine embraced Swift Arrow briefly, a gesture that communicated more than words could express. "Your arrow split my bonds," she said quietly. "Now, it must split the bonds of deception that hold my people." Swift Arrow's normally impassive features softened momentarily. "Arrow flies true when heart guides hand," he replied, touching his chest. "This heart will not fail." They separated, each moving to their designated position. Catherine circled wide through the trees, approaching the settlement from the direction of her cabin. Williams and Finch took a more direct route, prepared to emerge from between buildings at the crucial moment. Swift Arrow found a perfect vantage point. A massive pine at the forest edge, whose lower branches provided both concealment and a clear line of sight to the platform. Climbing with silent efficiency, he positioned himself, arrow-nocked, waiting for the precise moment. In the town square, Harrison had reached the crescendo of his performance. Hampton stood beside him, playing his role as the concerned citizen, who had uncovered the Shawnee conspiracy. The bloodied weapons lay displayed before the terrified townspeople. "Tonight, we will secure our future," Harrison proclaimed, his voice carrying clearly now to those waiting in the shadows. "Hampton's men will lead us to victory against the savages who have plotted our destruction." A murmur ran through the crowd, not of enthusiasm, but of fear and uncertainty. These were farmers, merchants, and tradespeople, not soldiers eager for battle. Even manipulated by Harrison's lies, they hesitated at the prospect of armed conflict. Catherine had reached her position behind the general store. Through a gap between buildings, she could see Jenkins among the gathered townspeople, his expression troubled as he listened to Harrison's call for violence. Swift Arrow drew his bowstring back with practiced precision, sighting along the shaft, to the platform where Harrison continued his inflammatory speech. The distance was considerable, over 100 yards, but well within his exceptional range. More challenging was the need for absolute precision. The arrow needed to strike the oak itself, just above Harrison's head, with enough force to embed itself, while not harming anyone. He held his breath, finding that perfect moment of stillness his grandfather had taught him. The world narrowed to a single point of focus, the rough bark of the ancient oak just above the judge's gesticulating form. The arrow flew, a blur against the afternoon sky, its carefully balanced weight compensating for the attached document. Those with keen eyes noticed it a split second before impact. A flash of feathered movement ending with a solid thunk as the arrow embedded itself in the oak's trunk directly above Harrison's head. The judge ducked instinctively, momentary panic, replacing his self-assured demeanor. Hampton's men raised their rifles, scanning for the unseen assailant. "Shawnee, attack!" someone shouted, nearly triggering the very panic Harrison had been cultivating. But before chaos could erupt, Williams strode into the square, his authoritative voice cutting through the confusion. "That's enough, Harrison!" The crowd turned as one, astonishment rippling through their ranks at the sight of the marshal they had presumed dead. Battered and disheveled but unmistakably alive, Williams advanced toward the platform with the unwavering confidence that had earned the settlement's trust for 15 years. "Marshal Williams," Jenkins called out, disbelief and hope mingling in his voice. "You're alive!" Harrison recovered quickly, his courtroom instincts taking over. "Williams! Thank God! We feared the worst when you didn't return. The Shawnee ambushed." "Save your lies, Judge," Williams interrupted, continuing his advance, despite the rifles now trained on him. "These good people deserve the truth you've denied them." Hampton made a subtle gesture, and his men began moving to intercept the marshal. But Williams kept walking, his gaze locked on the townspeople rather than the armed outlaws. "The arrow above the judge's head carries proof of his treachery," Williams announced. "A treaty map showing the true boundaries of Shawnee territory. The same map Harrison has tried to destroy because it proves the gold he covets belongs legally to the Shawnee people." Catherine chose this moment to emerge from her hiding place, stepping into view near the edge of the crowd. Gasps and exclamations erupted as the townspeople recognized the woman they had last seen chained to the very oak that now held Swift Arrow's arrow. "Catherine Harlow," she declared, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Falsely accused by Judge Harrison because I discovered his alliance with Hampton, an alliance formed not to protect you, but to steal Shawnee gold and blame the inevitable bloodshed on innocent people." Harrison's face contorted with fury. "Seize them," he ordered Hampton's men. "They've clearly been corrupted by Shawnee influence. The woman admitted her mixed blood. Now see how she turns against her own kind." Several outlaws moved to obey, but the townspeople's reaction wasn't what Harrison had anticipated. Instead of backing away from Catherine, Jenkins and several others moved to stand beside her. "I've known Catherine Harlow since she was born," Jenkins announced. "Watch her heal our sick, deliver our children, comfort our dying. If she says Harrison is corrupt, I'm inclined to believe her over a circuit judge who arrived with grand promises but delivered only fear." Harrison's carefully constructed narrative was unraveling. He turned to Hampton, desperation replacing calculation. Shoot them all if necessary. We can blame it on the Shawnee." Before Hampton's men could respond, Williams pointed to the arrow embedded in the oak. "Read the document. See the truth with your own eyes before more blood is spilled, Deputy." Collins, who had been stationed near the platform during the entire confrontation, made his decision. He climbed the steps and carefully removed the rolled document from the arrow shaft, opening it for all to see. "It's a treaty map," he confirmed loudly, "with official territorial seals and signatures. The disputed land is clearly marked as Shawnee territory." "A forgery!" Harrison shouted, but the desperation in his voice betrayed him. Hampton assessed the shifting mood of the crowd with a predator's instinct for danger. Unlike Harrison, he had no reputation to protect, no position to maintain. With a subtle signal to his most loyal men, he prepared to cut his losses and flee while confusion reigned. Catherine noticed the outlaw's preparation for escape. "He's going to run!" she called out, pointing to Hampton. "Don't let him escape!" Justice again. Swift Arrow, who had descended from his perch and worked his way closer through the chaos, chose this moment to act. Another arrow flew, this one striking the ground directly in front of Hampton's horse. The animal reared in panic, throwing its rider to the dirt. The sudden appearance of a Shawnee warrior in their midst might have once triggered fear, but the context had shifted dramatically. As Swift Arrow stepped into view, bow lowered but ready, the townspeople looked to Williams and Catherine rather than reaching for weapons. "This is Swift Arrow of the Shawnee," Catherine announced. "The man who freed me from unjust imprisonment, the man who helped rescue Marshal Williams from Hampton's camp where he was about to be executed on Harrison's orders." Harrison, seeing his carefully constructed plan disintegrating, made a desperate final attempt. "The Shawnee are massing for attack. Hampton discovered their war party preparing to strike. These weapons prove it." He gestured wildly to the bloodied items displayed on the platform. Swift Arrow stepped forward, his dignity a sharp contrast to Harrison's frantic energy. "Blood is pig blood," he stated clearly. "Weapons taken from Shawnee hunting camp Hampton burned. No war party, no attack." Bland. Williams seized the moment to deliver the final blow to Harrison's credibility. "Judge Ezekiel Harrison has conspired with known outlaws, falsely imprisoned innocent citizens, ordered my execution to prevent the truth from emerging, and planned to incite warfare against the Shawnee, all to claim gold deposits on land protected by legal treaty." The square fell silent as the full weight of these accusations settled over the gathering. Deputy Collins, still holding the treaty map, looked from Harrison to Williams, then made his choice. He drew his sidearm and pointed it at the judge. "Ezekiel Harrison, you're under arrest for conspiracy, attempted murder of a federal marshal, and treason against the territory." Hampton, seeing his partner's downfall, attempted to mount a defense. "You'll take the word of a half-breed woman and an Indian over a territorial judge?" he sneered, struggling to his feet. "What's happened to you people?" "We've opened our eyes," Jenkins replied, stepping forward, "and we choose truth over fear." As if on cue, Swift Arrow raised his arm, delivering the signal his warriors had awaited. From the forest edge emerged the 12 Shawnee braves, moving with deliberate purpose, but holding their weapons pointed downward in a clear gesture of restraint. Rather than provoking panic, their appearance served as visual confirmation of everything. Catherine and Williams had claimed these were not men preparing for massacre, but allies against a common enemy. Hampton's men, reading the shifting balance of power, began lowering their weapons. Without Harrison's authority or the element of surprise, they recognized the futility of their position, outnumbered now by the combined force of townspeople and Shawnee warriors. Hampton himself made one last desperate attempt, drawing his pistol and lunging toward Catherine, the woman whose accusations had unraveled everything. "You'll die before I hang," he snarled, raising his weapon. The shot never came. With impossible speed, Swift Arrow loosed a final arrow that struck Hampton's pistol with such force that it shattered the firing mechanism and sent the weapon spinning from his grasp. Hampton stared in disbelief at his bleeding hand, then at the Shawnee warrior whose arrow had found such an impossible target. Before he could recover, Williams was upon him, driving him to the ground with a powerful blow. "That," the marshal said with grim satisfaction, "was for my men you ambushed and the people you terrorized." In the aftermath, as Hampton and Harrison were secured in the undamaged portion of the jail under heavy guard, an unprecedented gathering took place beneath the Willow Creek oak. Chief Gray Fox, alerted by Swift Arrow's runners, arrived with additional tribal elders to meet with the settlement's leaders. Catherine found herself in the unfamiliar role of mediator, translating not just words, but intentions between two peoples who had viewed each other with suspicion for generations. "The gold in our territory has brought only suffering," Gray Fox observed as they discussed the future. "Perhaps it can now bring healing instead." Williams, his authority fully restored, proposed a solution. A joint council to oversee any mining activity, with profits shared between settlement and tribe. No single man controlling the wealth, no secret deals. As the discussions continued, Catherine stepped away briefly, finding Swift Arrow standing apart from both groups, his expression thoughtful as he gazed at the ancient oak. "You saved us all," she said quietly, joining him. "That shot to disarm. Hampton, I've never seen anything like it." Swift Arrow shook his head slightly. "Arrow only tool. Truth was the weapon that defeated enemies today." Catherine studied his profile, seeing beyond the warrior to the man, one whose courage and integrity had changed everything. "What will you do now? Return to your village?" "For now," he confirmed. "Help rebuild trust between our peoples." But paths that cross once often cross again. The implications of his words warmed something deep within her. "I would welcome that crossing whenever it comes." Swift Arrow turned to face her fully, allowing her to see what few ever witnessed, a genuine smile that transformed his stoic features. Healer woman and Shawnee tracker, strange alliance that begins a new story. Catherine returned his smile, aware of curious glances from both townspeople and Shawnee alike. "Let them look," she thought. "Let them see that bridges can be built where walls once stood." As sunset painted the valley in golden light, Catherine stood with Swift Arrow, Williams, and Gray Fox beneath the Willow Creek oak, the tree that had nearly been her gallows, but now witnessed the first tentative steps toward genuine peace. The ancient oak had seen generations come and go, had weathered storms and droughts, had witnessed justice and injustice beneath its spreading branches. Now it stood witness to something rare and precious, a moment when the truth's arrow had split not just chains, but the bonds of prejudice that had constrained two peoples for too long. Catherine touched the rough bark where Swift Arrow's first arrow had struck, freeing her from captivity. The scar would remain for years, perhaps decades, a reminder not of hatred, but of hope, not of division, but of the courage required to forge new paths. At that moment, as the diverse gathering began to disperse into the evening, Catherine realized that the most important bonds broken had been invisible ones, the constraints of fear and mistrust that had limited both communities. Swift Arrow's impossible shot had done more than split her chains. It had created an opening through which a different future might emerge. As if reading her thoughts, Swift Arrow placed his hand beside hers on the oak's weathered trunk. "Tree remembers," he said simply. "So will we." Catherine nodded, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, the arrow's path had changed their course irrevocably. From the hanging tree had sprung not death, but life, not ending, but beginning, a story to be told for generations yet unborn. The legacy of the legendary Shawnee archer and the healer who believed in truth's power would live on long after they returned to the earth, not in blood spilled for gold, but in bonds formed across boundaries once thought impenetrable, in a valley where two worlds had finally found common ground. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.